Introduction. Modern ideas on social equality and the psychological basis of history. Origin and development of the idea of equality. The consequences it has had. The price already paid for its application. Its influence at the present day on the masses. The problems examined in the present work. An inquiry into the principal factors of the general evolution of peoples. Is this evolution determined by institutions? The elements of each civilisation. Institutions, arts, creeds, etc., and whether they have not certain psychological foundations peculiar to each people. The element of chance in history and its permanent laws. The civilisation of a people is based on a small number of fundamental ideas, which determine its institutions, its literature, and its arts. These ideas come very slowly into being, and they are also very slow to disappear. Long after their erroneous nature has become clear to cultivated minds, they remain indisputable truths for the masses, and continue to exert their influence on the rank and file of the nation. It is difficult to obtain recognition of a new idea, but it is no less difficult to discredit an idea that has long been generally accepted. Humanity has always been exceedingly loath to abandon its decayed ideas and its moribund gods. It is barely a century and a half ago that certain philosophers, who, it should be remarked, were very ignorant of the primitive history of man, of the variations of his mental constitution, and of the laws of heredity, propounded the idea of the equality of individuals and races. This idea, which would naturally be most attractive to the masses, ended by firmly implanting itself in their mind, and speedily bore fruit. It has shaken the foundation of the old societies, given birth to the most formidable of revolutions, and thrown the Western world into a series of convulsions, the end of which it is impossible to foresee. Doubtless certain of the inequalities among individuals and races were too apparent to be seriously disputed, but people found it easy to persuade themselves that these inequalities were merely the outcome of differences of education, that all men are born equally intelligent and good, and that the sole responsibility of their perversion lies with the institutions they live under. This being the case, the remedy was simple in the extreme. All that had to be done was to reform the institutions and to give every man an identical education. It is in this way that institutions and education have ended by becoming the great panaceas of modern democrats, the means of remedying inequalities which clash with the immortal principles that are the only divinities that survive today. And yet science, as it has progressed, has proved the vanity of the theories of equality, and shown that the mental gulf created by the past between individuals and races can only be filled up by the slowly accumulating action of heredity. Modern psychology, together with the stern lessons of experience, has demonstrated that the institutions and the education which suit some individuals and some races are most harmful to others. But when ideas are once in circulation, it is not in the power of philosophers to destroy them when they arrive at the conviction that they are erroneous. Like a swollen stream that has overflown its banks, the idea continues its destructive progress, with which nothing can interfere. There is no psychologist, no traveller, no fairly intelligent statesman who is not aware how erroneous is this chimerical notion of the equality of men, which has thrown the world into confusion, brought about in Europe a gigantic revolution, involved America in the sanguinary war of succession, and landed all the French colonies in a state of lamentable decadence. Yet in spite of this knowledge, they are few indeed who venture to combat this notion. Moreover, the idea of equality, far from being on the decline, continues to make headway. It is in the name of this idea that socialism, which seems destined to enslave before long the majority of Western peoples, pretends to ensure their welfare. It is in its name that the modern woman, forgetting the deep-lying mental differences that separate her from man, claims the same rights and the same education as man, and will end, if she be triumphant, in making of the European a nomad without a home or a family. The masses scarcely trouble themselves about the political and social upheavals to which these levelling principles have given rise, or about the far graver events they have yet to bring forth, and the statesmen of the present day are in power too short a time for them to be more heedful. Moreover, public opinion has become the sovereign authority, and it would be impossible not to bow to it. The only real measure of the social importance of an idea is the influence it exerts on men's minds. The degree of truth or error it contains is only of interest from a philosophic point of view. When an idea has come to be a sentiment with the masses, all the consequences it involves must be undergone in succession. We see then that it is by means of education and institutions that the modern dream of equality endeavours to seek realisation. It is in their name that, reforming the unjust laws of nature, we attempt to cast in the same mould the intelligences of the Negroes, of the Martinique, of the Guadeloupe, and of the Senegal, those of the Arabs of Algeria, and finally those of the Asiatics. The chimera is doubtless quite unrealisable, but experience alone can show the danger of chimeras. Reason is incapable of transforming men's convictions. The object of this work is to describe the psychological characteristics which constitute the soul of races, and to show how the history of a people and its civilisation are determined by these characteristics. Neglecting details or only considering them so far as they are indispensable to the proof of the principles advanced, we shall examine the formation and mental constitution of the historic races, that is, of the races artificially formed in historic times by the chances of conquest, immigration, and political changes, and we shall endeavour to demonstrate that their history is determined by their mental constitution. We shall note the degree of fixity or variability of the characteristics of races. We shall try to find out whether individuals and peoples tend towards equality or, on the contrary, towards greater and greater differentiation. We shall then examine whether the elements composing a civilisation, its arts, its institutions, its beliefs, are not direct manifestations of the soul of races, and whether in consequence it is not impossible that they should pass from one people to another. We shall conclude by attempting to determine what are the necessities under the influence of which civilisations decay and die out. We have dealt at length with the problems in question in various works on the civilisation of the East. This short volume should be regarded as a brief synthesis. The point that has remained most clearly fixed in my mind, after long journeys through the most varied countries, is that each people possesses a mental constitution as unaltering as its anatomical characteristics, a constitution which is the source of its sentiments, thoughts, institutions, beliefs, and arts. Tocqueville and other illustrious thinkers have imagined that they have discovered in the institutions of the various peoples the cause of their evolution. I, on the contrary, am persuaded and hope to prove, while choosing my examples from the countries studied by Tocqueville, that institutions are of extremely slight importance as regards the evolution of civilisation. They are most often effects, and but very rarely causes. The history of peoples is determined, no doubt, by very different factors. It is full of particular cases, of accidents which have taken place but which might not have taken place. Side by side, however, with these chances, with these accidental circumstances, there are great permanent laws which govern the general course of each civilisation. The mental constitution of races proceeds from the most general, the most primordial of these permanent laws. The life of a people, its institutions, beliefs, and arts are but the visible expression of its invisible soul. For a people to transform its institutions, beliefs, and arts, it must first transform its soul. To enable it to bequeath its civilisation to another people, it would be necessary that it should be able to bequeath its soul. Doubtless this is not what history teaches, but we shall easily show that in recording contrary assertions it has allowed itself to be misled by vain appearances. The reformers who have followed one another for a century past have endeavoured to change everything, gods, the earth, and men, but their efforts have been wholly unavailing, so far as regards the century-old characteristics of the souls of races which time has established. The conception of the irreducible differences which separate human beings is entirely contrary to the ideas of modern socialists, but it is not the teachings of science that could induce the apostles of a new dogma to renounce their illusory doctrines. Their efforts are a new phase of the eternal crusade of humanity in quest of happiness, that treasure of Hesperides for which the peoples have been searching from the dawn of history onwards. The dream of equality would perhaps avail as much as the old illusions which cradled us in the past, were it not that it is destined to be shattered at an early date on the immovable rock of natural inequalities. Together with old age and death, these inequalities are a part of those apparent iniquities of which nature is full and to which man must submit. Chapter 1. The Soul of Races. How the naturalists classify species. Application of their methods to man. Defective side of the classifications of the human races, at present in vogue. Foundations of a psychological description. The average types of the races. How they may be established by observation. The psychological factors which determine the average type of a race. The influence of ancestors and that of the immediate parents. Common psychological groundwork possessed by all the individuals of a race. Immense influence of bygone generations on the present generation. Mathematical reasons for this influence. How the collective soul has spread from the family to the village, from the city to the surrounding district. Advantages and dangers of the conception of the city. Circumstances under which the formation of the collective soul is impossible. Example of Italy. How the natural races have given way to the historic races. Naturalists base the classification of species on the observation of certain anatomical characteristics, regularly and constantly reproduced by heredity. We are aware today that these characteristics are transformed by the hereditary accumulation of imperceptible changes. Still, if attention be confined to the comparatively short period covered by history, the species may be said to be invariable. Applied to man, the methods of classification of the naturalists have allowed of the determining of a certain number of perfectly distinct types. By the aid of clearly defined anatomical characteristics, such as the colour of the skin and the shape and volume of the skull, it has been possible to establish that the human race comprises several species which are quite distinct and probably of very different origin. In the eyes of the scientific men who are respectful of religious traditions, these species are simply races. However, as has been rightly observed, "If the Negro and the Caucasian were snails, all zoologists would affirm unanimously that they constitute excellent species, which could never have descended from the same couple from which they had gradually come to differ." These anatomical characteristics, those at least of them that can be traced by our analysis, only allow of very summary general divisions. Their divergencies are only perceptible in the case of the most distinct human species, of the white and yellow races, or the Negroes, for example. Peoples, however, that closely resemble one another as regards their physique, may be widely different as regards their modes of feeling and acting, and in consequence as regards their civilisations, beliefs, and arts. Is it possible, for instance, to class in one and the same group a Spaniard, an Englishman, and an Arab? Are not the mental differences that exist between them apparent to everybody, and to be detected throughout their history? In the absence of anatomical characteristics, it has been proposed to base the classification of certain peoples on various elements, such as language, belief, and political organisation. But this mode of classification will scarcely bear examination. The elements of classification which anatomy, languages, environment, or political organisation are incapable of furnishing are supplied by psychology, which shows that behind the institutions, arts, beliefs, and political upheavals of each people lie certain moral and intellectual characteristics that determine its evolution. It is the whole of these characteristics that form what may be called the soul of a race. Each race possesses a mental constitution, as unvarying as its anatomical constitution. There seems to be no doubt that the former corresponds to a certain special structure of the brain, but as science is not sufficiently advanced as yet to acquaint us with this structure, we cannot have recourse to it as a basis of classification. Moreover, a knowledge of it would in no way modify the description of the mental constitution of which it is the determining factor, and which is revealed to us by observation. The moral and intellectual characteristics whose association forms the soul of a people represent the synthesis of its entire past, the inheritance of all its ancestors, the motives of its conduct. They appear to be very variable in individuals of the same race, but observation proves that the majority of the individuals of a given race always possess a certain number of common psychological characteristics, which are as stable as the anatomical characteristics that allow of the classification of species, while, like these latter characteristics, the psychological characteristics are regularly and constantly reproduced by heredity. This aggregate of psychological elements observable in all the individuals of a race constitutes what may rightly be called the national character. Together they form the average type which permits of a people being defined. 1,000 Frenchmen, Englishmen, or Chinamen, chosen at hazard, offer notable differences amongst themselves, but nevertheless, owing to racial heredity, they possess common characteristics which allow of the determining of an ideal type of the Frenchman, the Englishman, and the Chinaman, analogous to the ideal type which the naturalist presents when he describes in a general manner the dog or the horse. Applicable to the different varieties of dogs or horses, such a description can only include the characteristics common to them all, and not those which enable their numerous individual specimens to be distinguished. Provided a race be sufficiently ancient and in consequence homogeneous, its average type is established with sufficient clearness for it to be readily noted by the observer. When we visit a foreign people, the only characteristics that can arrest our attention are precisely those that are common to all the inhabitants of the country we are travelling through, since they are the only characteristics that are constantly repeated. The individual characteristics, being seldom repeated, escape us, and before long we not only distinguish at first sight between an Englishman, an Italian, or a Spaniard, but we are perfectly able to ascribe to them certain moral and intellectual characteristics, which are the very fundamental characteristics that we referred to above. An Englishman or a Gascon, an inhabitant of Normandy or Flanders, corresponds to a type of which we have a perfectly clear idea and of which we can easily give a description. Applied to an isolated individual, the description may seem very inadequate and sometimes inexact. Applied to the majority of the individuals of one of these races, it will depict them perfectly. The unconscious process by which we arrive at an idea of the physical and mental type of a people is absolutely identical in its essence with the method by which a naturalist classifies species. This identity of the mental constitution of the majority of the individuals of a race is due to very simple physiological reasons. Each individual is the product not merely of his immediate parents, but also of his race, that is, of the entire series of his ascendants. A learned economist, M. Chisson, has calculated that in France, supposing there to be 3 generations in a century, each of us would have in his veins the blood of at least 20 millions of the people living in the year 1000. In consequence, all the inhabitants of a given locality of a given district necessarily possess common ancestors, are moulded of the same clay, bear the same impress, and they are all brought back unceasingly to the average type by this long and heavy chain of which they are merely the last links. We are the children at once of our parents and our race. Our country is our second mother for physiological and hereditary as well as sentimental reasons." If it be wished to state in precise language the influences which govern the individual and direct his conduct, they may be said to be of 3 kinds. The first, and certainly the most important, is the influence of ancestors. The second, the influence of the immediate parents. The third, commonly supposed to be the most powerful, but nevertheless the weakest, is the influence of the environment. The influence of environment, including in its scope the various physical and moral influences to which the individual is subjected during his life, and particularly during his education, produces but very slight variations. The influences of environment only become really effective when heredity has caused their action to be continued in the same direction during a long period. Do what he may then, the individual is always and above all the representative of his race. The totality of the ideas and sentiments that are, as it were, the birthright of all the individuals of a given country form the soul of the race, Invisible in its essence, this soul is very visible in its effects, since it determines in reality the entire evolution of a people. A race may be compared to the totality of the cells that constitute a living being. The existence of these milliards of cells is very short, whereas the existence of the being formed by their union is relatively very long. They possess at once their own personal life and a collective life, that of the being of which they form the substance. In the same way, each individual of a race has a very short individual life and a very long collective life. This latter life is that of the race of which he is sprung, which he helps to perpetuate, and on which he is always dependent. A race is to be regarded as a permanent being that is independent of time. This permanent being is composed of the long succession of the dead who were its ancestors, as well as of the living individuals who constitute it at a given moment. To understand the true signification of a race, it must be considered with regard both to its past and its future. The dead, besides being infinitely more numerous than the living, are infinitely more powerful. They reign over the vast domain of the unconscious, that invisible domain which exerts its sway over all the manifestations of the intelligence and of character. A people is guided far more by its dead than by its living members. It is by its dead and by its dead alone that a race is founded. Century after century our departed ancestors have fashioned our ideas and sentiments, and in consequence all the motives of our conduct. The generations that have passed away do not bequeath us their physical constitution merely, they also bequeath us their thoughts. The dead are the only undisputed masters of the living. We bear the burden of their mistakes, we reap the reward of their virtues. The formation of the mental constitution of a people does not demand, as does the creation of animal species, those geological periods whose immense duration defies calculation. Still, the time it demands is considerable. To create in such a people as the French, even to the comparatively slight extent accomplished as yet, the community of sentiments and thought that forms its soul, more than 10 centuries have been necessary. This lapse of time, long as it may seem from the point of view of history, is in reality comparatively short, since it only represents 30 generations. The reason why so relatively brief an interval is sufficient to fix certain characteristics is that when a cause acts for some length or time in the same direction, it speedily produces very considerable effects. Mathematics teach us that when a cause persistently produces the same effect, the causes increase in arithmetical progression, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., and the effects in geometrical progression, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. The causes are the logarithms of the effects. In the famous problem of the doubling of the grains of wheat on the squares of a chessboard, the successive numbers of the square are the logarithms of the number of grains of wheat. Similarly, in the case of money invested at compound interest, the number of years in the logarithm of the accumulated capital. It is for reasons of this order that the majority of social phenomena may be expressed by very nearly similar geometrical curves. In another work I arrived at the conclusion that these curves might be expressed analytically by the equation of the parabola or the hyperbola. My learned friend M. Chisholm is of the opinion that they are better represented as a rule by an exponential equation. Perhaps the most important result of the French Revolution was to hasten this formation by greatly promoting the breaking up of the minor nationalities. Picards, Flemish, Burgundians, Gascons, Bretons, men of Provence, etc., into which France was formerly divided. Doubtless the unification is far from being complete, and it is more especially because we are composed of two varied races, and in consequence have two different ideas and sentiments, that we are the victims of dissensions unknown to more homogeneous peoples, to the English, for example. In England, the Saxon, the Norman, and the ancient Briton have ended by forming, as the result of fusion, a very homogeneous type, and everything in consequence is homogeneous in the domain of conduct. Thanks to this fusion, the English have acquired in a high degree the three fundamental bases of the soul of the people: common sentiments, common interests, and common beliefs. When a nation has reached this stage, there is an instinctive agreement amongst all its members on all great questions, and it ceases to be a prey to serious dissensions. This community of sentiments, ideas, beliefs, and interests, created by slow hereditary accumulations, gives a high degree of identity and fixity to the mental constitution of a people. It was the cause of the greatness of Rome in ancient times, and at the present day it is the source of the greatness of England. The moment it disappears, peoples begin to break up. The role of Rome was at an end when it ceased to possess it. The congeries of sentiments, ideas, traditions, and beliefs which form the soul of a collectivity of men has always existed, more or less in the case of all peoples and at all ages, but its progressive extension has been slowly accomplished. Restricted at first to the family and gradually extended to the village, the city, and the province, the collective soul has only spread to all the inhabitants of a country in comparatively modern times. It was only when this last result had been achieved that the notion of a native country, as we understand it today, came into existence. The notion is not possible until the national soul is formed. The Greeks never got beyond the notion of the city, and their cities were always at war, because in point of fact they were always very foreign to one another. For 2000 years past, India has known no other unity than the village, and it is for this reason that for 2000 years the country has always been subject to foreign rulers, whose ephemeral empires have come to an end as easily as they were formed. Weak though it be from the point of view of military strength, the conception of the city as the sole native country has, on the contrary, always been very effective from the point of view of the development of civilisation. Though less spacious than the soul of the native country, the soul of the city has at times been more fruitful. Athens in ancient times, Florence and Venice during the Middle Ages show us the degree of civilisation which may be attained to by small agglomerations of men. When small cities or small provinces have lived an independent life for a considerable length of time, they end by possessing so stable a soul that its fusion with those of neighbouring cities and provinces, with a view to the formation of a national soul, becomes almost impossible. Such a fusion, even if it be capable of being brought about, as happens when the elements brought together are not too dissimilar, is never the work of a day, but only that of centuries. To achieve such a work, a Richelieu or a Bismarck is necessary, but they only bring it to a head when it has been long in elaboration. It is possible indeed for a country, as has happened in the case of Italy, to arrive suddenly, as the result of exceptional circumstances, at forming a single state, but it would be a mistake to suppose that it thus acquires simultaneously a national soul. It is clear to me that in Italy there are Piedmontese, Sicilians, Venetians, Romans, etc., but it is not clear as yet that there are Italians. At the present day, whatever be the race under consideration, whether it be homogeneous or not, by the mere fact that it is civilised and for a long while past has played its part in history, it must always be regarded as an artificial and not as a natural race. Natural races are scarcely to be met with except among savages. It is only among savages that it is possible to find peoples of absolute racial purity. At the present day, the majority of civilised races are merely historical races. We are not concerned here with the origin of races. That they have been formed by nature or by history is beyond our purpose. What interests us is their characteristics such as they have been constituted by a long past, kept up during centuries by the same conditions of existence, and accumulated by heredity. These characteristics have ended by acquiring a high degree of fixity and by determining the type of each people. Chapter 2. The limits of the variability of the character of races. The variability of the character of races, and not its fixity, constitutes the apparent rule. Reasons for this appearance: invariability of the fundamental characteristics and variability of the secondary characteristics. Analogies between the psychological characteristics and the irreducible and modifiable characteristics of the animal species. It is only environment, circumstances, and education that influence the accessory psychological characteristics. The possibilities of character, examples furnished by the different periods, the men of the Terror, what they became at different periods, how national characteristics endure in spite of revolutions, various examples, conclusion. It is only by a careful study of the evolution of civilisations that the fixity of the mental constitution of races is brought home to the observer. At first sight it is variability and not fixity that appears to be the general rule. The history of peoples might induce the belief that their soul undergoes on occasion very rapid and very far-reaching transformations. Does there not seem, for example, to be a very considerable difference between the character of an Englishman of the time of Cromwell and that of a modern Englishman? Does not the circumspect and subtle Italian of the present day seem a very different being from the fierce and impulsive Italian described in the memoirs of Benvenuto Cellini? Not to go so far afield and to confine ourselves to France, how numerous are the apparent changes of character in the course of a few centuries, and even at times in the course of a few years. What historian has not remarked the difference between the French national character of the 17th and 18th centuries, and in modern times can anything seem more distinct than the character of the ferocious conventionalists and that of the docile slaves of Napoleon? And yet they were the same men, though in the space of a few years they seem to have changed entirely. To elucidate the causes of these changes, we will remind the student in the first place that a psychological species is formed, as is an anatomical species, of a very small number of irreducible fundamental characteristics around which are grouped accessory characteristics which are modifiable and changeable. The breeder who transforms the apparent structure of an animal, or the gardener who modifies the aspect of a plant to such a degree that it is unrecognizable to the unpractised eye, has not affected to the slightest extent the fundamental characteristics of the species. All they have done has been to influence the accessory characteristics. In spite of all the artifices employed, the fundamental characteristics always tend to reappear with each new generation. The mental constitution possesses fundamental characteristics as immutable as the anatomical characteristics of animal species, but it also possesses accessory characteristics that are easily modified. It is these latter characteristics that may easily be changed by environment, circumstances, education, and various other factors. It must also be remembered, and the point is essential, that we all possess in our mental constitution certain possibilities of character which circumstances do not always provide with an opportunity of manifesting themselves. When they come to the front, a new and more or less ephemeral personality at once takes shape. It is in this way that at times of great political or religious crisis, momentary changes of character are observed which would seem to indicate that manners, ideas, conduct, everything, in short, had undergone a change. Everything has indeed changed, as happens to the tranquil surface of a lake lashed by a storm, but it is rare that the change is lasting. It is in consequence of these possibilities of character put in operation by certain exceptional events that the actors in great religious and political crises appear to us to be made of superior stuff to ourselves, to be a sort of giants of whom we are the degenerate sons. In reality, they were men like ourselves in whom circumstances had given free rein to possibilities of character possessed by all of us. Take, for example, "the giants of the Convention," who held Europe in check and sent their adversaries to the guillotine for mere contradiction. At bottom, they were respectable, pacific citizens like ourselves, who in ordinary times would probably have led the most tranquil and retired existence in their studies or behind their counters. Extraordinary events caused the vibration of certain of their brain cells, which under usual conditions would not have been called into activity, and they developed into those colossal figures whom posterity is at a loss to understand. Born 100 years later, Robespierre would doubtless have been an upright magistrate, on excellent terms with the local priest. Fouquier Tinville, a magistrate possessing, perhaps in rather a higher degree than his colleagues, the harshness and supercilious manners of his profession, but greatly appreciated for his zeal in bringing delinquents to book. Saint Just would have made an excellent schoolmaster, esteemed by his chiefs and very proud of the decoration he would certainly have ended by obtaining. To remove all doubt as to the accuracy of these provisions, it is sufficient to note what Napoleon accomplished with such of the ferocious terrorists as had not the time to cut off mutually each other's heads. The majority of them became staid officials, tax collectors, magistrates, or prefects. The waves stirred up by the storm of which we spoke above had calmed down, and the troubled lake had recovered its tranquil surface. Even in the most troubled periods, in those which produced the strangest variations of personality, it is easy to trace the fundamental characteristics of the race beneath the new developments. Was there much difference in reality between the centralised dictatorial and despotic regime of our strict Jacobins and the centralised dictatorial and despotic regime to which 15 centuries of monarchy had accustomed the French nation? All the revolutions of the Latin peoples result in this obstinately recurring regime, in this incurable need of being governed, because it represents a sort of synthesis of the instincts of the race. It was not solely the glamour attaching to his victories that enabled Bonaparte to make himself master of France. When he transformed the Republic into a dictatorship, the hereditary instincts of the race manifested themselves day by day with greater intensity. Indeed, in the absence of an officer of genius, any adventurer might have filled his part. 50 years later, the heir to his name had only to show himself to obtain the votes of a people tired of liberty and eager for servitude. It was not the 18th Brumaire that established the fortunes of Napoleon, but the soul of his race, which he was about to trample beneath his iron heel. Footnote, "At this gesture," writes Taine, "the French bowed in obedience, and they persisted in their attitude, as if it were their natural condition. The humble, the soldiers and the peasants, with animal fidelity; the great, the dignitaries and functionaries, with Byzantine servility. The republicans offered no resistance. On the contrary, it was among them that he found the best instruments of his reign. His senators, deputies, state councillors, judges and officials of every rank. Beneath their talk of liberty and equality, he had been quick to divine their dictatorial instincts, their need of commanding, of surpassing their fellows, and even subsidiarily, and in addition, their hungering after wealth and pleasure. Between the delegates of the Committee of Public Safety and the minister, the prefect or the sub-prefect of the empire, the difference is slight. The man is the same, and it is only the costume that is altered. The carmagnole has been exchanged for an embroidered uniform." End of footnote. The influence exerted on men by environment appears so great because it operates on the accessory and transitory elements, or on those possibilities of character which we have been speaking. In reality, the changes are not very profound. The mildest man driven by hunger attains to a degree of ferocity which renders him capable of every crime, and even leads him occasionally to devour his fellow man. Will it be said on this account that his habitual character has definitely changed? If the conditions of civilisation procure a minority extreme wealth, and develop in its members all the vices which are the inevitable consequence of luxury, if they arouse violent desires in the remainder of the population without supplying the means of satisfying them, the result will be general discontent and unrest, which will influence conduct and provoke upheavals of every kind. But amid this discontent and these upheavals, the fundamental characteristics of the race will always show themselves. In the past, the English-born inhabitants of the United States, when engaged in civil war, displayed the same indomitable energy as they exhibit today in founding towns, universities, and manufactories. The national character has not been modified. It is merely the objects that bring it into play that have changed. When examining in succession the various factors capable of influencing the mental constitution of peoples, we always observe that their influence is exerted on the accessory and transitory sides of character, while they scarcely affect the fundamental elements, or only affect them as the result of very slow hereditary accumulations. We do not conclude from what precedes that the psychological characteristics of peoples are invariable, but only that they possess, like the anatomical characteristics, a high degree of fixity. It is on account of this fixity that the soul of races changes so slowly during the course of ages. Chapter 3. The psychological hierarchy of races. Psychological classification is based, as are anatomical classifications, on the determination of a small number of irreducible and fundamental characteristics. Psychological classification of the human races, the primitive races, the inferior races, the average races, the superior races, the psychological elements, the groupings of which allow of this classification, the elements which are of the most importance, character, morality, the intellectual qualities are modifiable by education, The qualities appertaining to character are irreducible, and constitute the unvarying element in each people. Their role in history. Why it is impossible for different races to understand and influence one another. The reasons why it is impossible for an inferior people to adopt a superior civilisation. When the grounds are examined in a work on natural history of the classification of species, it is at once observed that the irreducible, and in consequence the fundamental characteristics which allow of the determination of each species, are very few in number. Their enumeration always occupies but a few lines. The reason is that the naturalist only concerns himself with the unvarying characteristics, and pays no heed to the transitory characteristics. Moreover, these fundamental characteristics have as their inevitable consequence an entire series of other characteristics. The case is the same with the psychological characteristics of races. If details be gone into, innumerable slight divergencies are found to exist between different peoples and different individuals. On the other hand, if only the fundamental characteristics be considered, they are seen to be very few in number for each people. It is only by examples, we shall shortly adduce examples that are highly characteristic, that it is possible to show clearly the influence of this small number of fundamental characteristics on the life of peoples. The only way to set forth the basis of psychological classification of races being to study in detail the psychology of the different peoples, a task that would demand in itself several volumes, we shall confine ourselves to indicating their main lines. If only their general psychological characteristics be considered, the human races may be divided into four groups. 1. The primitive races. 2. The inferior races. 3. The average races. 4. The superior races. The primitive races are those in which no trace of culture is met with. They have remained in that state bordering on animality which was traversed by our ancestors of the age of stone instruments. The Fuegians and the aboriginal Australians are examples in point. Above the primitive races are found the inferior races, represented more especially by the Negroes. They are capable of attaining to the rudiments of civilisation, but to the rudiments only. They have never been able to get beyond quite barbarian forms of civilisation, even when chance has made them the heirs, as at St. Domingo, of superior civilisations. Above the primitive races are found the inferior races, represented more especially by the Negroes. They are capable of attaining to the rudiments of civilisation, but to the rudiments only. They have never been able to get beyond quite barbarian forms of civilisation, even when chance has made them the heirs, as at St. Domingo, of superior civilisations. Among the average races we shall place the Chinese, the Japanese, the Mongolians, and the Semitic peoples. In the case of the Assyrians, the Mongolians, the Chinese, and the Arabs, they have created high types of civilisation which only the European peoples have been able to surpass. Only the Indo-European peoples can be classed among the superior races. Both in antiquity at the epoch of the Greeks and Romans and in modern times, they alone have been capable of great inventions in the arts, the sciences, and industry. It is to them that is due the high level reached by civilisation at the present day. It is they who have discovered steam and electricity. The least developed of these superior races, the Hindus in particular, have risen to a level in the arts, letters, and philosophy to which the Mongolians, the Chinese, or the Semites have never been able to attain. No confusion is possible between the four great divisions we have just enumerated. The mental abyss that separates them is evident. It is only when it is desired to subdivide these groups that the difficulties begin. An Englishman, a Spaniard, or a Russian belong all of them to the division of superior peoples, but it is a matter of common knowledge that the differences between them are very great. To determine these differences with precision, it would be necessary to take each people separately and to describe its character. This is the course we shall shortly follow in the case of two of these peoples, in order to give an application of the method and to show the importance of its consequences. For the moment we can only indicate very summarily the nature of the principal psychological elements which allow of the differentiation of races. Among the primitive and inferior races, and to find such races, it is not necessary to go to the pure savages, since the lowest strata of the European societies are homologous with the primitive men. A greater or less incapacity to reason is always met with. An incapacity, that is, to associate in the brain, with a view to compare them and to perceiving their analogies and differences, the ideas produced by past sensations or the words that are their signs, and the ideas produced by present sensations. There results from this incapacity to reason a great credulity and a complete absence of the critical spirit. In the case of the superior being, on the contrary, the capacity of associating ideas and of drawing conclusions from their association is very great, while the critical spirit and precision are highly developed. The inferior races further display but an infinitesimal power of attention and reflection. They possess the spirit of imitation in a high degree, the habit of drawing inaccurate general conditions from particular cases, a feeble capacity for observation and for deriving useful results from their observations, an extreme mobility of character, and a very notable lack of foresight. The instinct of the moment is their only guide. Like Esau, the type of the primitive being, they are inclined to sell their birthright for a mess of pottage. When man is capable of weighing his future against his immediate interest, of giving himself a goal and pursuing it with perseverance, he has realized a considerable progress. The incapacity to foresee the distant consequences of acts and the tendency to be guided solely by the instinct of the moment condemns the individual as well as the race to remain forever in a very inferior state. It is only in proportion as they are able to dominate their instincts, in proportion, that is, as they acquire will power and in consequence empire over themselves, that peoples can understand the importance of discipline, the necessity of sacrificing themselves to an ideal, and of raising themselves to a civilised state. Were it required to measure by a single standard the social level of peoples in history, I should be disposed to take as standard the degree of their aptitude for dominating their reflex impulses. The Romans in antiquity, the Anglo-Americans in modern times, represent the peoples who have possessed this quality in the highest measure. It has largely contributed to assure their greatness. It is by their general grouping and their respective development that the various psychological elements just enumerated form the mental constitutions which allow of the classification of individuals and races. Certain of these psychological elements appertain to character and others to intelligence. The superior races are distinguished from the inferior races by their character as well as by their intelligence, but it is more especially by their character that the superior races are distinguished from one another. This point has considerable social importance, and it deserves to be clearly established. Character is formed by the combination in varying proportions of the different elements which psychologists are accustomed at the present day to designate by the name of sentiments. Among the sentiments which play the most important part must more especially be noted perseverance, energy, and the power of self-control, faculties more or less dependent on the will. We would also mention morality among the fundamental elements of character, although it is the synthesis of somewhat complex sentiments. By morality we mean hereditary respect for the rules on which the existence of a society is based. To possess morality means for a people to have certain fixed rules of conduct and not to depart from them. As these rules vary with time and place, morality appears in consequence to be a very variable matter, and it is so in fact. But for a given people at a given moment it ought to be quite invariable. The offspring of character and in no wise of the intelligence, it is not solidly constituted until it has become hereditary, and in consequence unconscious. In a general way, the greatness of peoples depends in a large measure on the level of their morality. The intellectual qualities are susceptible of being slightly modified by education. Those of character almost wholly escape its influence. When education does affect them, it is only in the case of neutral natures, whose will is almost non-existent, and who are ready in consequence to follow whatever impulse may be given them. These neutral natures are met with in individuals, but very rarely in an entire people, or should they be thus observed, it is only in times of extreme decadence. The discoveries of the intelligence are easily transmitted from one people to another. The transmission of the qualities appertaining to character is impossible. They are the irreducible, fundamental elements which allow of the differentiation of the mental constitutions of the superior peoples. The discoveries due to the intelligence are the common patrimony of humanity. Qualities or defects of character constitute the exclusive patrimony of each people. They are the firm rock which the waters must wash, day by day for centuries before they can even wear away its external asperities. They are the equivalent of the irreducible element of the species, of the fins of fish, of the beak of the bird, of the tooth of the carnivorous animal. The character of a people, and not its intelligence, determines its historical evolution and governs its destiny. It is always to be met with behind the apparent fantasies of that most powerless chance, that most fictitious providence, that very real fate which, according to varying beliefs, guides the actions of men. The influence of character is sovereign in the life of peoples, whereas that of the intelligence is in truth very feeble. The Romans of the decadence possessed an intelligence far more refined than that of their rude ancestors, but they had lost the qualities of character of the latter, the perseverance, the energy, the invincible tenacity, the capacity to sacrifice themselves to an ideal, the inviolable respect for the laws which had made the greatness of their forefathers. It is due to their character that 60,000 English are able to maintain beneath their yoke 250 millions of Hindus, many of whom are at least their equals in intelligence, while a few surpass them immensely as regards their artistic taste and the depth of their philosophic views. It is in consequence of their character that they are the masters of the most gigantic colonial empire known to history. It is character and not intelligence that goes to the founding of societies, religions, and empires. Character it is that enables peoples to feel and act. They have never derived much advantage from too great a desire to reason and think. Footnote: the extreme weakness and slight practical interest of the works of professional psychologists is more especially to be ascribed to the fact that they have confined themselves almost exclusively to the study of the intelligence, and have almost entirely neglected that of character. M. Paul Hahn, in his interesting Essai sur les caractères, and M. Ribot, in a few passages, unfortunately only too short, are almost the only psychologists I can recall who have pointed out the importance of character, and noted that it forms the true basis of the mental constitution. Quote, "The intelligence," unquote, the learned professor of the College of France rightly declares, quote, "is only an accessory form of the mental evolution. The fundamental type is character, which the intelligence rather tends to destroy when it is too developed." Unquote. It is to the study of character that attention must be directed, as I am attempting to show in these pages, when it is desired to describe the comparative psychology of peoples. It would be difficult to understand that a science so important for history and politics and its derivations should never have been made the object of study, were it not for the knowledge that it can be acquired neither in laboratories nor in books, but only in the course of long travel. There is no indication, moreover, that it is on the eve of being taken up by the professional psychologists, who at the present day are more and more abandoning what used to be their domain and confining themselves to anatomical and psychological researches. End of footnote. It is the mental constitution of races that determines their conception of the world and of life, and in consequence their conduct. We shall shortly support this statement by important examples. Impressed in a certain manner by external things, the individual feels, thinks, and acts in a very different manner from that in which will feel, think, and act those who possess a different mental constitution. The consequence is that it is impossible that mental constitutions, constructed as they are on very varied lines, should arrive at mutual comprehension. The century-old conflicts of races are the result more particularly of the incompatibility of their respective characters. It is impossible to arrive at any understanding of history unless it be continually borne in mind that different races cannot feel, think, or act in the same manner, and that in consequence they cannot comprehend one another. Doubtless the different peoples have in their languages common words which they imagine are synonymous, but these common words arouse entirely dissimilar sensations, ideas, and modes of thought in those who hear them uttered. It is necessary to have lived among peoples whose mental constitution differs to a sensible degree from our own, even though frequenting amongst them only such individuals as speak our language and have received our education, to appreciate the depth of the gulf that separates the thought of the various peoples. It is impossible to obtain some idea of this phenomenon without having recourse to extensive travel. By observing the great mental separation that exists between the civilised man and woman, even when the latter is highly educated. The man and the woman may have common interests and sentiments, but never like chains of thought. They might converse with one another for centuries without understanding one another, because they are constructed on lines too different to allow of their being impressed in the same manner by external things. The difference in their logical faculties is alone sufficient to create between them an insuperable gulf. This abyss between the mental constitution of the different races explains how it is that the superior peoples have never been able to impose their civilisation on inferior peoples. The idea, still so widespread, that education can achieve this result is one of the most baneful illusions that the theoreticians of pure reason have ever brought into existence. Thanks to the memory possessed by the most inferior beings, a privilege in no wise confined to man, it is doubtless possible for education to impart to an individual somewhat low down in the human scale the totality of the notions possessed by a European. A Negro or a Japanese may easily take a university degree or become a lawyer. The sort of varnish he thus acquires is however quite superficial and has no influence on his mental constitution. What no education can give him, because they are created by heredity alone, are the forms of thought, the logic, and above all the character of the Western man. Our Negro or our Japanese may accumulate all possible certificates without ever attaining to the level of the average European. It is easy to give him in 10 years the culture of a well-educated Englishman. To make a real Englishman of him, that is to say, a man acting as an Englishman would act in the different circumstances of life, 1,000 years would scarcely be sufficient. It is only in appearance that a people suddenly transforms its language, its constitution, its beliefs, or its arts. For such changes to be really accomplished, it would be necessary that it should be able to transform its soul. Chapter 4. The progressive differentiation of individuals and races. The inequality between the different individuals of a race is greater in proportion to the superiority of the race. Mental equality of all the individuals of inferior races. To appreciate the differences that separate races, the superior individuals of each people, and not its average representatives, must be compared. The progress of civilisation tends towards a greater and greater differentiation of individuals and races. Consequences of this differentiation. The psychological reasons which prevent its becoming too considerable. The individuals of the superior races are highly differentiated as regards their intelligence, and very slightly so as regards their character. How heredity constantly tends to reduce individual superiorities to the average type of the race. Anatomical observations confirming the progressive psychological differentiation of races, individuals, and sexes. The superior races are not distinguished from the inferior races solely by their psychological and anatomical characteristics. A further distinction is supplied by the diversity of the elements of which they are composed. All the individuals of the inferior races, even as regards those of different sex, are on sensibly the same mental level. They all of them resemble one another, and they are thus a perfect exemplification of the equality dreamed of by our modern socialists. In the case of the superior races, on the contrary, the intellectual inequality of the individuals and the sexes is the law. For this reason, in order to appreciate the differences that separate peoples, their superior representatives, when they possess such, and not their inferior, must be compared. Hindus, Chinese, and Europeans are but slightly differentiated intellectually, so far as their average representatives are concerned. On the other hand, when their superior representatives are compared, their differentiation is found to be considerable. With the progress of civilisation, not only races, but also the individuals of each race, those at least of the superior races, tend to become more and more differentiated. The result of modern civilisation, clashing with our dreams of equality, is not to render men more and more equal intellectually, but on the contrary, more and more different. One of the principal consequences of civilisation is, on the one hand, to differentiate races by the daily increasing intellectual exertion it demands of peoples who have attained to a high degree of culture, and on the other to widen the distinctions between the various grades of which each civilised people is composed. The conditions of modern industrial evolution condemn the inferior classes of civilised peoples to a highly specialised labour which, far from increasing their intelligence, merely tends to lessen it. 100 years ago a workman was a veritable artist, capable of executing all the details of any piece of mechanism, of a watch for example. Today he is a mere toiler, who never produces more than one specialty, who spends his life boring the same holes, polishing the same portion of an article, driving the same machine. The result is that the atrophy of his intelligence is soon complete. The manufacturer or the engineer who directs the workman is obliged, on the contrary, owing to the pressure of discoveries and competition, to possess far more numerous acquirements and much more enterprise and invention than his predecessor of a century back. His brain is constantly exercised, and undergoing the law which applies to all organs in such a case, becomes more and more developed. Tocqueville had already pointed out this progressive differentiation of the social grades at a period when industry was far from having attained to the degree of development it has reached today. In proportion as the principle of the division of labour receives more thorough application, the workman becomes weaker, of narrower intelligence and more dependent. Art progresses, the artisan falls back. Every day the difference between the employer and the workman increases. At the present day a superior people may be considered, from the intellectual point of view, to constitute a sort of pyramid of steps, the majority of which are formed by the masses of the population, the upper steps by the intelligent classes. I say intelligent without adding cultured. It is a characteristic error of the Latin peoples to believe that intelligence and culture go together. Culture merely implies the possession of a certain amount of memory, but to acquire it no judgment, reflection, initiative or invention are necessary. Persons of very restricted intelligence are often met with among those who have passed examinations, while it is quite as common to find persons of a very slight degree of culture who are highly intelligent. The upper portion of our pyramid would be formed then by elements taken from all classes. All the professions contain a very small number of notable intelligences. Still it appears probable, in virtue of the laws of heredity, that what are known as the superior social classes contain the greater number, and it is doubtless herein that their superiority lies. And the point of the pyramid by a very small elite of men of science, inventors, artists and writers, an exceedingly restricted group as compared with the rest of the population, but the only group that determines the rank of a country in the intellectual scale of civilisation. It would suffice for it to disappear, for all that constitutes the glory of a nation to disappear at the same time. Were France, as Saint Simon has rightly observed, to lose suddenly its 50 leading men of science, its 50 leading artists, its 50 leading manufacturers, its 50 leading agriculturalists, the nation would become a body without a soul. It would be decapitated. If, on the contrary, it were to lose all its officials, the French would grieve at the loss because they are soft-hearted, but the country would sustain very little harm." With the progress of civilisation, the differentiation between the extreme grades of a population proceeds with great rapidity. It even tends on occasion to increase in what mathematicians call geometrical progression. It would suffice, in consequence, if certain effects of heredity did not intervene, to allow time to act to see the superior grades of a population separated intellectually from the inferior grades by a distance as great as that which separates the white man from the Negro, or even the Negro from the monkey. For several reasons, however, this intellectual differentiation of the social grades, considerable though it becomes, is not accomplished with the rapidity that might be possible theoretically. In the first place, the differentiation is almost confined to the intelligence, and affects the character to a very slight extent, and we know that it is the character and not the intelligence that plays the fundamental part in the life of peoples. In the second place, the masses are tending at the present day, in virtue of their organisation and discipline, to become all-powerful. Their hatred of intellectual superiority being evident, it is probable that every intellectual aristocracy is destined to be violently destroyed by periodic revolutions in proportion as the masses become organised, and just as the ancient nobility was destroyed a century ago, when socialism shall have become master in Europe, its only chance of enduring will be to exterminate all the individuals, without exception, endowed with a superiority capable of raising them, however slightly, above the most humble level. The two causes I have just set forth are of an artificial order, since they are the result of conditions of civilisation that may vary. But there is a further and far more important cause. It is an irresistible natural law, which will always prevent the elite of a nation, not from becoming intellectually differentiated from the inferior grades, but from becoming so differentiated too rapidly. The present conditions of civilisation, which tend more and more to differentiate men of the same race, are confronted by the powerful laws of heredity, which tend to bring about the disappearance of the individuals who surpass the average in too marked a manner, or at least to bring them down to this average. Observations already old, recorded by the authors of investigations into heredity, have proved that the descendants of families distinguished by their intelligence are subject sooner or later, and most usually at an early date, to a process of degeneration which tends to extinguish them entirely. Great intellectual superiority seems, then, to carry with it the penalty that those who possess it leave behind them degenerate offspring. In reality, the point of the social pyramid of which I spoke above can only subsist on the condition that it assimilates elements from below. If all the individuals composing this elite were to be relegated to an isolated island, their intermarriages would result in the formation of a race displaying a variety of degenerate symptoms and destined in consequence to disappear speedily. Great intellectual superiorities may be compared to the botanical monstrosities created by the artifice of a gardener. Left to themselves, they die off or return to the average type of the species, for the species is all-powerful since it represents the long series of ancestors. Attentive study of the different peoples shows that while the individuals of a given race may be immensely differentiated as regards the intelligence, they are but slightly differentiated as regards the character, that unalterable rock of which I have already shown the permanence throughout the ages. In studying a race, it should be considered in consequence from two very different points of view. From the intellectual point of view, its value depends on a small elite, to which is due the scientific, literary, and industrial progress of the civilisation. From the point of view of character, acquaintance with the average is alone important. The strength of peoples is always dependent on the level of this average. Peoples may do at a pinch without an intellectual elite, but not without a certain level of character. We shall shortly prove this statement. It is thus seen that while the individuals of a race become more and more differentiated intellectually, as time goes on, they always tend, as far as character is concerned, to oscillate round the average type of the race. It is to this average type, which progresses very slowly, that the great majority of the members of a nation belong. Around this fundamental kernel is found, in the case at least of the superior peoples, a thin layer of eminent minds, whose action is of capital importance as regards civilisation, but is without importance as regards the race. Incessantly being destroyed, it is incessantly being renewed at the expense of the average grades, which for their part vary but very slowly, since the slightest variations, in order to become durable, must be accumulated in the same direction by heredity during several centuries. It was several years ago that I arrived, basing my conclusions on researches of a purely anatomical order, at the idea just enunciated touching the differentiation of individuals and races, and to justify which I have now invoked none but psychological reasons. As the two kinds of observation lead to the same results, I may be allowed to recall some of the conclusions of my earlier investigations. They are based on measurements executed on several thousands of skulls, ancient and modern, belonging to different races. I proceed to give the more essential passages. The volume of the skull bears a close relation to the intelligence. When leaving individual cases out of consideration, series are dealt with. It is then found that what distinguishes inferior from superior races is not the slight variations in the average capacity of their skulls, but this essential fact that the superior race contains a certain number of individuals whose brain is highly developed, whereas the inferior race contains no such individuals. Races differ in consequence not in respect to the masses that constitute them, but in respect to the small number of individuals who stand out from the crowd. The average difference between the skull in the case of two peoples, except when quite inferior races are under consideration, is never very considerable. When the skulls are compared of the various human races belonging to the past and present, it is found that the races in which the volume of the skull presents the greatest individual variations are the most highly civilized races. That in proportion as a race grows civilized, the skulls of the individuals composing it become more and more differentiated, a fact which leads to the result that civilisation conduces not to intellectual equality, but to an inequality that is always growing more pronounced. Anatomical and physiological equality only exist in the case of individuals of quite inferior races. The differences between the members of a tribe of savages, all of whom follow the same occupation, are perforce of the slightest. Between the peasant whose vocabulary consists of some 300 words and the man of learning who is familiar with 100,000 words and with the ideas that correspond to them, the difference is, on the contrary, enormous. I should add to what precedes that the differentiation of individuals brought about by the development of civilisation is also apparent in the case of the sexes. Among inferior peoples or the inferior classes of superior peoples, the man and the woman are intellectually on much the same level. On the other hand, in proportion as peoples grow civilized, the difference between the sexes is accentuated. The volume of the male and female skull, even when the subjects compared, as in my investigations, are strictly of the same age, height and weight, presents differences that increase rapidly with the degree of civilisation. Very slight in the case of the inferior races, these differences become immense in the case of the superior races. In these superior races the feminine skulls are often scarcely more developed than those of the women of very inferior races, whereas the average volume of the skulls of male Parisians is such as to range them among the largest known skulls. The average of the skulls of female Parisians classes them among the smallest skulls with which we are acquainted, almost on a level with the skulls of Chinese women, and scarcely above the feminine skulls of New Caledonia. Footnote: Dr. Gustave Le Bon, Recherches anatomiques et mathématiques sur les variations des volumes du cerveau et sur leurs relations avec l'intelligence. 8, volume 1879, memoir crowned by the Academy of Sciences and by the Society of Anthropology. End of footnote. Chapter 5. Formation of the historical races. How historical races are formed. Conditions which allow of different races combining to form a single race. Influence of the number of the individuals involved in the process, of the dissimilarity of their characters, of the environments, etc. Results of crossbreeding. Causes of the great inferiority of half-breeds. Mobility of the new psychological characteristics created by crossbreeding. How these characteristics come to be fixed. The critical periods of history. Crossbreeding constitutes an essential factor in the formation of new races, and at the same time a powerful factor in the dissolution of civilisations. Importance of the regime of castes. Influence of environment. Environment can only exert its influence on new races in process of formation, and on races whose ancestral characteristics are giving way before the action of crossbreeding. Environment is without influence on old races. Various examples. The majority of the historical races of Europe are still in process of formation. Political and social consequences. Why the period of formation of historical races will soon be over. We have already remarked that genuine races, in the scientific sense of the word, are scarcely to be met with among civilized peoples, but only historical races, by which is meant races created by the chances of conquest, immigration, politics, etc., and formed in consequence of a mixture of individuals of different origins. How do these heterogeneous races come to combine and to form an historical race possessing common psychological characteristics? This is the point we are about to investigate. Let it first of all be observed that the elements brought together by chance do not always combine. The German, Hungarian, Slav and other populations that live under Austrian rule form perfectly distinct races, which have never attempted to fuse. The Irish, who live under the rule of the English, are another example of fusion not taking place. As for the quite inferior peoples such as Redskins, Australians or Tasmanians, not only do they not combine with the superior peoples, but they disappear rapidly after they have come in contact with them. Experience proves that every inferior people which is confronted with a superior people is inevitably condemned to disappear at an early date. Three conditions are necessary to allow of races fusing and forming a new and more or less homogeneous race. The first condition is that the races which are to interbreed shall not be too unequal in number. The second, that their characters shall not be too dissimilar. The third, that they shall be subjected for a long period to identical conditions of environment. The first of the conditions that have just been enumerated is of capital importance. A small number of white men transported into the midst of a numerous Negro population disappear after a few generations without leaving any trace of their blood among their descendants. All the conquerors who have invaded too numerous populations have disappeared in this way. They have been able, as has been done by the Latins in Gaul or the Arabs in Egypt, to leave behind them their civilisation, their arts and their language, but they have never been able to bequeath their blood. The second of the preceding conditions is also of very great importance. Doubtless very different races, the black and the white for example, may fuse, but the half-breeds that result constitute a population very inferior to those of which it is sprung, and utterly incapable of creating or even of continuing a civilisation. The influence of contrary heredities saps their morality and character. When half-breeds, the offspring of white men and Negroes, have chanced to inherit a superior civilisation, as in St. Domingo, this civilisation has speedily been overtaken by the most lamentable degeneration. Cross-breeding may be a source of improvement when it occurs between superior and sufficiently allied races, such as the English and the Germans of America, but it always constitutes an element of degeneration when the races, even though superior, are too different. All the countries inhabited by too large a proportion of half-breeds are, solely for this reason, given over to perpetual anarchy, unless they are ruled by an iron hand. Such will inevitably be the fate of Brazil. White men form only a third of its population. The remainder is composed of Negroes and mulattoes. The famous Agassiz rightly observed, quote, that it is sufficient to have visited Brazil for it to be impossible to deny the decadence that results from cross-breeding, which goes on in this country to a greater extent than elsewhere. This cross-breeding is fatal, he says, to the best qualities whether of the white man, the black or the Indian, and produces an indescribable type whose physical and mental energy suffers." Unquote. End of footnote. To cross two peoples is to change simultaneously both their physical constitution and their mental constitution. Cross-breeding, moreover, constitutes the only infallible means at our disposal of transforming in a fundamental manner the character of people, heredity being the only force powerful enough to contend with heredity. Cross-breeding allows of the creation of a new race, possessing new physical and psychological characteristics. The characteristics thus created are at the outset very weak and fluctuating. To fix them long, hereditary accumulations are necessary. The first effect of interbreeding between different races is to destroy the soul of the races, and by their soul we mean that congeries of common ideas and sentiments which make the strength of peoples, and without which there is no such thing as a nation or a fatherland. The period of interbreeding is the critical period in the history of peoples, a period of commencement and hesitancy which all nations have had to traverse, for there is scarcely a European people that is not formed of the debris of other peoples. It is a period full of intestine struggles and of vicissitudes, and it continues so long as the new psychological characteristics are not fixed. What precedes shows that interbreeding should be considered at once as a fundamental element in the formation of new races and as a powerful factor in the dissolution of ancient races. It is with reason, then, that all the peoples that have reached a high degree of civilisation carefully avoid intermarrying with foreigners. Had it not been for the admirable regime of castes, the handful of Aryans that invaded India some 3,000 years ago would have been quickly swamped by the immense masses of the dark-coloured populations that surrounded them on every side, and no civilisation would have come into existence on the soil of the great peninsula. If in modern times the English had not followed the same system, if they had consented to intermarry with the indigenous inhabitants, their gigantic Indian empire would long since have slipped from their grasp. A people may sustain many losses, may be overtaken by many catastrophes, and yet recover from the ordeal, but it has lost everything, and is past recovery when it has lost its soul. It is at the moment when decadent civilisations have become the prey of peaceful or warlike invaders that interbreeding fills in succession the destructive and then the creative role of which I have just spoken. Cross-breeding destroys an ancient civilisation because it destroys the soul of the people that possesses it. It fosters the creation of a new civilisation because the old psychological characteristics of the races in contact have been destroyed, and because new characteristics may be formed under the influence of the new conditions of existence. It is only on races in course of formation and whose ancestral characteristics have been destroyed in consequence by contrary heredities that the influence can be effective of the last of the factors mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, the influence of environment. While very slight on ancient races, the influence of environment is, on the contrary, very great on new races. Cross-breeding, by destroying the ancestral psychological characteristics, creates a sort of blank tablet on which the action of environment, continued during centuries, may succeed in impressing and finally in giving fixity to new psychological characteristics. Then, and then only, the formation of a new historical race results. It is in this way that the French race was constituted. The influence of environment, physical or moral, is in consequence very great or very slight, according to circumstances, and this is the explanation of the contrary opinions that have been formulated with regard to its action. We have just seen that this influence is very great on races in course of formation, but had we been considering ancient races solidly established by the long action of heredity, we could have said that the influence of environment is, on the contrary, almost inappreciable. As regards moral environment, we have proof of the significance of its action in the failure of our Western civilisations to influence the peoples of the East. Even when these latter have been subjected to their contact during several generations, the Chinese inhabitants of the United States are a case in point. The slight power of physical environment is shown by the difficulties that attend acclimatization. Transported into surroundings too different from those to which it is accustomed, an ancient race, and the statement is equally applicable to men, animals and plants, perishes sooner than submit to transformation. Egypt has always been the tomb of the many different races that have effected its conquest. Not a single people has been able to acclimatize itself in the country. Neither Greeks, Romans, Persians, Arabs, nor Turks have been able to leave behind them a trace of their race. The only type that is met with is that of the impassible fellah, whose features exactly resemble those engraved 7,000 years ago on the tombs and palaces of the pharaohs by the Egyptian artists. The majority of the historical races of Europe are still in course of formation, and it is important that it should be known that this is the case with a view to understanding their history. At the present day, the Englishman is the only European who represents an almost completely fixed race. In this case, the ancient Briton, the Saxon, and the Norman have given way to a new and highly homogeneous type. In France, on the contrary, the provincial is very different from the Breton, the inhabitant of Auvergne from the inhabitant of Normandy. Still, if there does not exist as yet an average type of the Frenchman, there at least exists average types of certain regions. Unfortunately, these types are very distinct as regards their ideas and character. It is difficult in consequence to devise institutions which shall suit them all equally well, and it is only by dint of energetic concentration that it is possible to lend them some community of thought. Our profound divergences of sentiment and belief, and the political upheavals which result therefrom, are due in the main to differences of mental constitution, which the future alone will perhaps be able to efface. Such has always been the situation when different races have found themselves in contact. The dissentiments and intestine struggles have always been the more acute in proportion as the races in presence have been the more different. When they are too unlike, it becomes absolutely impossible to make them live under the same institutions and the same laws. The history of great empires composed of different races has always been identical. Most often they disappear with their founder. Among modern nations only the English and the Dutch have been successful in imposing their yoke on Asiatic peoples, differing widely from them, and their success is solely due to the fact that they have respected the manners, customs and laws of the peoples in question, leaving them in reality to govern themselves, and confining their role to appropriating a portion of the taxes, to engaging in commerce, and to maintaining peace. Apart from these rare exceptions, all the great empires composed of dissimilar peoples owe their foundation to force and are destined to perish by violence. To enable a nation to constitute itself and to endure, it is necessary that its formation should be slow, and the result of the gradual fusion of but slightly different races, interbreeding, living on the same soil, undergoing the action of the same environment, and having the same institutions and beliefs. After the lapse of several centuries, these distinct races may come to form a highly homogeneous nation. As the world grows older, the races become more and more stable, and their transformation by means of fusion rarer and rarer. As it advances in age, humanity feels the burden of heredity grow heavier, and transformations become more difficult. So far as Europe is concerned, it may be said that the era of the formation of historical races will soon be over.